Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the First Congregational Church of Laingsburg's online service. My name is Pat. I will be your host for today. Today is the 10th week of Ordinary Time. We are in a series entitled Bread and Water, which is an exploration through John chapter 6. Before we explore this chapter, we have a few poems, prayers, and readings for us along the way. Blessings on our journey.
Psalm 78, retold by Malcolm Guite. He led me out of darkness into light, and now I will proclaim all he has done to rising generations. My delight will be to share the story of the one who came to me before I came to him, whose love still greets me with each rising sun. But neither will I hide my sin and shame. The many times that I refused his grace and turned my back on him, forgot his name, and sought my former darkness, turned my face away from my Redeemer. I'll confess my own perversity and dare to trace my willful trespass in the wilderness, and how through all of this my Lord stayed true and pulled me through with patient tenderness.
We light this candle to remind us of the humanity of Christ, who lived a full human experience like us. So we can now
Mommy, I can't do it.
embrace every facet of our humanity, body, mind, and heart as part of our call to become like God. Now let me help you. We light this candle to remind us of the divine nature of Christ, who overcame with love every evil we conceived, and whose resurrection proves to all the world that love overcomes evil, sin, and even death. Say yay!
Yay! Bye!
All right, before we listen to this passage read to us by Olivia, I thought it would help us to get a little bit of recap, because nothing big and fancy happens in this passage. It actually happens right after something real big and fancy. If you want a deeper dive recap, just go to last week's online service and you can kind of get a recap of what's going on. But just overall, for us today, this is happening right after the miracle of the feeding of 5,000 with just the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And then the people there's a whole crowd that he fed, and the people want to make him king because of this miracle that he did. More on that last week. So Jesus retreats up into the hills, and the disciples go down to the water to wait for Jesus. And they're waiting by the boat. It's getting dark. He doesn't come. So the disciples totally abandon Jesus, get in the boat, and leave without him. So Jesus then comes back down the mountain, sees that they left without him in the boat, starts walking on the water to get to the disciples who abandoned him. And then a gale storm is kind of rip-roaring the boat apart, and the disciples are freaking out. Jesus gets into the boat, or Jesus gets to the boat, and then it says immediately they arrive at their destination, which kind of tells us that he made the entire trek across the water on foot, never got in the boat. Cool little aside there. So now this passage here that we're going to read, it kind of comes up the next morning. The crowds on the other side of the lake that Jesus left behind, they start waking up, and they're looking around, and they're looking at the evidence, and they're saying, okay, there was only one boat here, and they left without him, and Jesus ain't here. He must have crossed the lake somehow. They don't know how he got there, so they take off in their boats and go across the lake looking for Jesus. They find him on the other side of the lake, and they kind of put 2 and 2 together that somehow a miracle happened. We saw the miracle of the feeding of all these people with 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish. And somehow Jesus crossed the lake and they're not sure. So their initial question, how'd you get here? So that's our recap. Let's hear this passage read and take this story the next leg of the journey.
Good morning, everybody. Today's reading comes from John 6, verses 24 through 35. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "Very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has placed a seal of approval." Then they asked him, "What must we do to do the works God requires?" Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." So they asked him, "What sign then will you give, that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." "Sir," they said, "always give us this bread." Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty."
So I was on the social medias the other day and I ran into a post from a pastor that's getting a lot of airtime. And this post said something along the lines that says, "Anxiety is a light form of atheism." Anxiety is a light form of atheism, and made me anxious to read that because I have anxiety a bit. So then it kind of, his anxiety post gave me anxiety and made me an atheist for a hot second, I guess. So it didn't do what he wanted it to do. Well, it's a weird thing to think that anxiety is the polar opposite of having faith. That's what he's trying to say, is that anxiety and faith are the opposites to one another. And I think we're doing apples and oranges at this point to say that anxiety is a light form of atheism, because anxiety is this emotion felt, usually caused by circumstances and a mix of brain chemicals. Anxiety is an emotion felt, and faith is not an emotion felt. Faith is not this counter emotion that's the antidote for the emotion of anxiety. So to compare the two is kind of like apples and oranges, and to say if you ever experience anxiety then somehow you've lost faith is, I think, an improper understanding of what faith is and what anxiety is altogether. What Jesus has here is this conversation between a crowd and himself, and the word faith comes up. And the word faith that he's using here, John in his gospel uses it like a lot. Like, just, it's his favorite word in the whole gospel, is the word faith. And now this understanding that faith is a thing that counters an emotion called anxiety, that makes faith a noun, because it's a thing that is something with substance that counters an emotion that you have called anxiety. When actually, in the Greek language here, in the Gospel of John, faith is a verb, and it means to believe. It means to trust. So what Jesus is going to teach us in this passage today, that faith is not the counter emotion for feeling anxiety. Faith in verb form is a trust in God. It's a trust that leads to actions taken in your life despite emotions felt about those actions. You're going to do it anyway. It's trust that the way that Jesus lived his life is worth living for us too, even if it leads to the same kind of persecution that Jesus faced, because we know resurrection is on the other side of this life. So this faith is this trust, a trust in a belief that living this way Jesus lived is actually worth it. It actually works, and it actually has the power to change the world around us. So we're going to explore this a little bit more. Let's dive into this passage and see what we see. All right, so the crowd shows up, they see Jesus, and they have this suspicion that something miraculous has happened. Maybe they have a suspicion that he crossed the water, walked on the water to get here. So they ask that question, how'd you get here? We know something grand just happened. But what the crowd is after is another loaf of bread. That's what they're after. And Jesus knows this, so he goes into this dialogue about don't spend all of your energy in the food that perishes, searching for and getting and eating the food that perishes, but put your energies into this eternal life, or this eternal bread. What does that even mean? Because bread was important enough for Jesus to give it to these people in a miraculous sign just the previous day, and they've come for more because they're hungry. That's an important thing, to have your daily bread, right? So Jesus is not saying, this spiritual eternal bread is more important than the other bread. He's saying that the other bread, the bread that perishes, the stuff that we need to get by day, can become so all-consuming that we become kinds of people that seek to acquire this. And then we start using means to acquire our daily bread. And then we want more bread. And then we accumulate more bread. And then we take bread from somebody else. And then we, start putting people into oppression to get more bread and storing up bread. So he's saying that an obsession with surface needs and daily needs can actually cost your soul something, because you turn into a kind of person that manipulates and uses power and violence to get what you want at the expense of other people. When we become so obsessed with getting daily bread, getting surface needs met. So this eternal bread, the bread that doesn't perish, he's saying focus on not just getting the daily bread, because God knows you need daily bread, right? Don't just merely focus on that. You focus on that, then you become into this scheming, manipulative, violent person to get it at the expense of other people. He's saying instead, focus on who you're becoming as you work for the daily bread that is being given to you, as you're receiving the daily bread that's being given to you. Focus on who you are and who you're becoming, and then let the daily bread come into your life as it comes. Don't focus on that and grasping for all of those things. Focus on the becoming and your identity and your value and who God is. Because Jesus knows that how you get something determines who you are when you have it. And if we are so obsessed with getting the daily bread that we become manipulative and violent people oppressing others to get it at their expense, that turns us into a kind of person that sours the world we live in. And he's saying, don't become so obsessed with daily bread that you miss out on who you're becoming as you pursue it. So the crowd comes up with this question: what do we do to do the works of God? Now there's a couple of things there. There's like 3 do's. What do we do to do the works of God? What do we do to do the works of God? A lot of doing. There's plenty of doing to be done in this life, and it is exhausting work to do all the doings, right? So they want more doings. What are the more doings that we have to do to receive some kind of blessing from God? They use this plural, works. What are the works? And to see the works of God in our life. So what are the things we got to do in order to get some more daily bread in our life, is what they're asking Jesus. And Jesus, instead of saying, well, out of the 613 laws in the Old Testament, or the Torah, or whatever you want to call it, here are the top 25 that you ought to keep and do a really good job at. And then you'll be all right. You'll open yourself up to the blessing of God, some kind of prosperity gospel thing. Jesus does not say that. He actually converts the word works, plural, into work, singular. And he says, here is the work that you're supposed to do. Believe in the one whom God has sent. It's like, so Jesus here takes all of this, how do I live my life in such a way that it would make God happy enough to give us more daily bread? And he converts all of that action, all that exhausting action, and he says, focus on one thing, this one work. Believe the one whom God has sent. Believe in the one whom God has sent. Now, this belief is not a worldview that we cram inside of our head that is like a Jesus-centered worldview, and now we know how the world was made, and now we know what is real true, opposed to the mainstream, all the other mainstream stuff out there. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. Because this word belief, or believe, is a verb. It's not a noun you put in your brain. Believe is a verb that you do with your life. And it is to believe in the one whom God has sent, which is Jesus. It's to believe that the way Jesus lived his life is actually worth living for us too. This is the one thing that we are to be obsessed with over and above just getting the daily breads that we need. Jesus is saying here that we are to be obsessed with the one thing of who we are becoming in this world, who God is making us to be in this world, and to live in such a trusting way with God that we live the pattern Jesus laid out for us with our own life, regardless if it brings the kind of persecution that it brought Jesus, because we trust that this life is worth living. This life is more powerful than death. This life is a life of love that overcomes evil. It's an eternal life. And that's not a life somewhere else from an alien planet that invades us and our bodies and our worlds and our minds. Eternal is this word of equality. It's a right here and now life, drenched, soaked like a sponge, dipped into a bucket of water, soaked all the way through and permeating with the life of heaven. That's what eternal life is. This life lived in the present that's so high in the quality of love and life of heaven that it transcends even death. So what's next? You're going to be shocked at what the people say. I guarantee it. So the people's response to this is, if you want us to give you that kind of trust, you're going to have to show us a sign. You're going to have to prove it. And then they do this, they hurl kind of an insult of Jesus because they compare him to somebody else in their history. And this man was named Moses. They're saying Moses did this. Moses did it better than you. Moses was cooler than you, Jesus, is what they're saying, because they said, you know, you fed us once yesterday. That was cool and all. But Moses fed us for 40 years in the desert. And it wasn't that, you know, crummy barley bread that you gave us. Moses actually gave us manna from heaven. It was this honey cake bread. It was great. And here you are, you're just giving us barley bread and you're only doing it once. Where's the bread, Jesus? Now remember, they wanted to take Jesus and make him king after he did this, because they said, oh, he's the prophet that Moses talked about. And now here they are comparing him to Moses, saying, well, if you're the prophet Moses talked about, how come you're not as cool as Moses is? How come we don't have more bread and better bread than what we got going on today? So they're comparing Jesus to Moses, saying, you're just not as cool. You're going to have to do more signs for us to believe you. And their obsession with this getting daily bread and then enthroning Jesus as the provision source of this bread, so, to kind of secure their power and provision in this world. So who's going to need trust if we got a guy that just pops bread out like magic? You know, no trust is needed if, you know, if bread is just popping out like magic from sources unknown, right? There's not a lot of trust. So Jesus is actually saying the kind of trust I'm asking of you is more than the trust that the Israelites had in the wilderness. It's a different kind of trust. It's a deeper kind of trust. And they don't like that at all. They would rather not. And while they compare Jesus to Moses, Jesus does a different comparison. He says it actually wasn't Moses that was giving out the bread in the wilderness. That was God. And you're missing the point of that one. He's saying, I gave you this barley bread, and Moses gave this manna bread from heaven, this honey cakes that fell from the sky every evening and fed them for 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus actually does this crazy saying. He's saying, I was the bread. That was me. I am the manna. And here God is giving you manna in the wilderness. and you're acting just like they did. You're overlooking it. And I'm calling for a deeper trust out of you, not to enthrone this source of provision to ensure your power, but to live in a trusting manner that says, follow me and watch what I do and watch how I live. So this next part is the last part, and Jesus says something pretty interesting, and we'll close it out after this. So Jesus here has offered the barley bread to the people because Jesus knows that it's an exhausting thing to be a human being in this world and to get your daily bread, your daily essentials, your daily needs. It's an exhausting thing to do that, and Jesus knows this. He has compassion on the people and does give them bread. But this story is not just about God will give you your daily bread, but this story is about keeping our eyes on what is important in the pursuit of daily bread, in the pursuit of our daily needs. And because it's easy in the pursuit of daily bread to forget who we are, to forget how God has made us, to forget the things that God has blessed us with in this world to do, and just get so obsessed with getting things done and getting it done fast and getting it done more, glorious than the last time and better than other people. And we can oftentimes just forget who we are in the process of getting our daily bread and become obsessed with the rat race of getting our daily bread. So it's one thing that Jesus wants us to keep one eye on. The other eye we're supposed to keep on is don't forget who God is in the process of getting your daily bread. We're going to have to get our daily bread. That's just a reality of existence. We got to get things done and get it and get our daily bread for the day. But don't forget who God is in the process of this either. Because sometimes in the pursuit of getting the daily bread, we can lose sight of who we are and who God is and who we're called to be in this world, and the important stuff of who we're becoming in the world in pursuit of our daily bread. We forget that, how we get something determines who we are when we have it very often. So there are things that are more important than daily bread. Daily bread's very important. You need it to survive, but there are other things that are more important, like who we're becoming and who God is and how we should be in this world. And Jesus says to live in trust in this manner, to trust these things. Even if we die, we get to live in trust. Brennan Manning is one of my favorite authors, and he said this quote about trust. And he believed that trust was kind of the final work of his life. He talked about a lot of things during his life, but his final book that he wrote before he died was all about trust and learning to live in this trusting relationship with God. And he writes this about trust, and it's my favorite and not my favorite all at the same time. He says, the way of trust is a movement into obscurity, into the undefined, into ambiguity, not into some predetermined, clearly delineated plan for the future. The next step discloses itself only out of a discernment of God acting in the desert of this present moment. So what if we trusted our soul's pace, ability to keep a pace in this world? What if we trusted our soul's capacity to do in a single day what we can do, because God made both our capacity of soul and the pace that we can keep? What if we trusted that this manner of walking and living that Jesus lived and taught us to do is actually worth living for us as well? That it's like God approved way of living. What if we trusted the desert of this present moment that we're in today, here and now and today, and trust that God gives manna, God gives daily bread, God gives us what we need for each day. And if we just lived in this trust in the moment, that today is going to work itself out. There's enough worries today has for today, right? We don't have to be so anxious, but we can feel anxiety but have trusting actions in place of them. So what if we trusted the goodness of God and lived free of manipulation, of violence, of any form of getting at the expense of another person? And what if we trusted the arc of our life, the long arc, not just the immediate important things that make us anxious, the next bill, the next paycheck, the next meal, the next shopping trip, the next vacation, the next raise, the next promotion. What if we trusted the overall arc of our life long term, and who we're becoming is taken in effect on this, and not merely focused on the anxiety of getting today's daily bread, but focused in on this longer term. I think if we lived with this in mind, all of these things, our soul's pace and capacity, this manner of walking that Jesus taught us, living in this present moment and letting that define our trust, and trusting the long arc of our life. If we lived in this manner, I think it could save us much anxiety and exhaustion, and not all of it. It's going to happen naturally. But there is this blessing for the exhausted that John O'Donoghue, a Irish Catholic philosopher and priest, poet, has written, and we're going to have that read for us today. And I would like to leave us with this benediction of the blessing for the exhausted, because I think there's a lot of us in there that are feeling this way.
Good morning. I have a reading here to share with you today called A Blessing for One Who is Exhausted by John O'Donoghue. When the rhythm of the heart becomes hectic, time takes on the strain until it breaks. Then all the unattended stress falls in on the mind like endless, increasing weight. The light in the mind becomes dim. Things you could take in your stride before now become laborsome events of will. Weariness invades your spirit. Gravity begins falling inside you, dragging down every bone. The tide you never valued has gone out, and you are marooned on unsure ground. Something within you has closed down, and you cannot push yourself back to life. You have been forced to enter empty time. The desire that drove you has relinquished. There is nothing else to do now but rest and patiently learn to receive the self you had forsaken in the rush of days. At first, your thinking will darken, and sadness take over the listless weather. The flow of unwept tears will frighten you. You have traveled too fast over false ground. Now your soul has come to take you back. Take refuge in your senses. Open up to all the small miracles you rushed through. Become inclined to watch the wave rain when it falls slow and free. Imitate the habit of twilight, taking time to open the well of color that fostered the brightness of day. Draw alongside the silence of stone until its calmness can claim you. Be excessively gentle with yourself. Stay clear of those vexed in spirit. Learn to linger around someone of ease who feels they have all the time in the world. Gradually, you will return to yourself, having learned a new respect for your heart and the joy that dwells far within slow time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us online today. We hope this service has been and is a blessing to you. What now? Number one, you could participate. If you would like to participate in our services, we welcome your readings with a simple phone recording. Number two, partner. If you would like to give financially to ensure the continuation of this online service, there's a link at the bottom of your screen. Number three, you can subscribe. You may subscribe on YouTube or like our Facebook page to stay up to date with our online services. We hope you found some hope, help, and healing today. See you next week.